Liz. I'm very pleased to have you here with us at Security in Context. Let me briefly introduce you to our audience. Liz Oliva Fernández is an award winning Cuban journalist and also the host of the acclaimed documentary series, The War on Cuba, which is produced by the independent media outlet Belly of the Beast. And Ms. Oliva Fernández has received numerous awards. I wanted to mention just a few, which include the 2021 Gracie Award, the 2021 One World Media Award, and the 2022 Telly Award. Thank you so much for taking time to chat with me today. So
It's
I
a
wanted to
pleasure.
start, thank you, thank you. I wanted to start with a question for our audience that is quite broad. And we know that the U.S. government's sanctions against Cuba have a very long history, so it's impossible to review them in their entirety. But I was wondering if we could start with a broad idea of what is the overall nature of these sanctions, what it has been, and what has the consequence been for the Cuban people.
Oh, thank you for having me in your program, Security in Contest. It's a pleasure for me being here today. Well, the sanctions is like a system of law that is trying to isolate Cuba from the rest of the world. The most of the time, people think that the sanctions only affect the commercial intention that exist between United States and Cuba, but the sanctions go beyond that because the main goal is, in some point, that the Cuban people get so desperate that they try to overcome their own government. That's the goal. Not because I'm saying it, they say it, they put it down, they write it down. It's in the U.S. National security interest. Um, the consequence for the Cuban people has been like more or less depends of the time. So you need to understand that the sanctions is not the sanctions that have been in place for more than 60 years is not the same. The sanctions that we have nowadays, they are different from the sanctions that we have in the 60s, in the 90s, in the 20s. So, and it affects all the Cuban people, not only the government, as US politicians should say repeatedly. And it affect you most depend of your race, your gender, and your social class in Cuba. Depending if you live in Cuba, depending if you live outside of Cuba in the United States or in Europe, for example. I say that, and this is important because I think that Cuba as a country couldn't detach itself from the legacy of the colonialism. So we have exist inside of even when we have like a social justice, and we had a really good program for social justice at the beginning of the revolution and trying to have social equality for everybody. There is racism still persists. Homophobic is still persists in the country, and not only in the country but in the cultural way that the people think, and also in the way that the country is built on. So the sanctions at the end, like the consequence, the final product is to put more weight on this, for example. So you can suffer more or less depend of your what side of your society you live, or you are enjoying, or your privilege. So, and right now the situation in Cuba is really difficult. The scarcity, the food, medicine went to from bad to worst. Um, I don't think I think that in this point of our life, in Cuba, the major problem for the young people is that we can't see that we have like a future inside of Cuba. It's really difficult to realize and to think about that because the current situation is so critical that it stop us to think about, okay, maybe I have like a really opportunity, professional opportunity or personal opportunity in my country. Because before the pandemic, the situation was bad, but not so bad as the current situation, because of course Cuba, as the rest of the world, have to go through a pandemic that was global, that put in crisis like really wealthy countries, like they suffer for economic crisis, inflation. Imagine that Cuba has to face that, suffering the sanctions at the same time. And the sanctions that everybody's talk about, by a Trump policy on Cuba, but for me it's Trump Biden policy on Cuba, because it's Trump put in place by Trump, but Biden just doesn't do nothing so far. So it's the same system of sanctions, and now they are trying to flexibilize some laws. They are trying to allow remittances again. They're trying to open more flights to Cuba. But again, if you live in Miami, or if you have spent time in Miami, you could see that the most Cuban families who live there are white. So remittances for white families in Cuba, like a middle class in Cuba. So this is not something they are doing, like a small steps, but this is not like a things that really have an impact in Cuban people. For example, take Cuba out of the terrorism list. That's something that could have like an impact in all of us, not just in a few of people.
So, Liz, you mentioned that the scope of the sanctions has been very broad, and that it's, we can talk about a very long history, but you mentioned some important changes in the recent history. So I was wondering if we could talk how those sanctions have changed, let's say, from the Obama administration through Trump and what you call the Trump slash Biden set of policies in which we're in today. If you could give us a sense for audiences in the US who may not be familiar, and not just in the US, but in other parts of the world outside of Cuba, what that looks like in the day to day, in the concrete, for the Cuban people on the ground.
Well, um, first, when the Obama Raul Castro presidency started the new process of normalizations between the United States and Cuba, everything in Cuba changed. Well, that had a real impact in our life to life, not only because like millions of tourism, U.S. tourism come to Cuba. We have intershare cultural intershare between the two countries. And you can see that this is empowered a lot to the private business in Cuba, and everybody was. It's like a domino effect. If you have a if you have a house and you rent a house, of course you are going to have like a more incomes, because you are like dealing with the tourists and investment in tourists. But you also need to hire more people to help you in order to get the process running. And maybe you need to do some reforms. So you are going to hire an architect or carpenter, or someone who maybe you need to buy drinks, and so you are going to pay a busy taxi or a taxi in order not just to get the tourists around, also to get your products into your house. So it's a domino effect. Everybody is getting money. Everybody's is improving their life. Everybody has a job, has a way to earn today the money that they need for the daily basis, day to day. Um, when Trump came to the president, everything that Obama have done in that moment rolled all back, and that was crazy, because Cuba changed so hard that the first thing that he do is like he closed the U.S. embassy in Havana. In that moment, everybody was thinking about how the Havana syndrome, well, Sony attacks, Havana syndrome, microwave attacks, all the kind of attacks. We in the War in Cuba, we dedicate episode 4 to trying to explain to the people what is happened at that moment. But the change was so drastic that they could, every way that Cuba was trying to get the money, like they cut tourism, they attack Cuban missions, not just in Cuba, it's around the world. But people that don't know, you Cuba sends doctors around the world for different crises. At the beginning, of the missions were for free. So he was saying, Cuba was saying, Cuban doctors around the world for, again, for trying to fight Ebola, or the earthquake in Haiti, or this is what they get. Where is a crisis in whatever country in the world, and Cuba was trying to get doctors there to help. Well, and in some moment, Cuba started to charge to the wealthiest countries, because it is because they don't have doctors. Of course, that every country have doctors. The problem is that doctors that work for the private sector don't want to go to the far places, with the rural places where people must need them. So that was the happening of Brazil, that they have like a large population and we don't have. So in that moment, uh, Trump administration started to attack Cuban missions around the world. Uh, they cut, so it was really even more difficult for Cuba trying to open an account in a bank account around the world, or asking for credits, because, and when they put Cuba in the state sponsor of terrorism list, was a death sentence for Cuba, because that, if nobody wants to deal with Cuba because everybody's afraid of the United States actions or consequence because they're dealing with Cuba, imagine dealing with Cuba and that they call us terrorists. Nobody wants to do nothing with all that. So that really have a real impact in in our country, and was so difficult because at the time was COVID pandemic around, and we are trying to fix it. In fact, Cuba asked for being part of COVAX. I don't know if you know, but COVAX is a program of the United Nations that allows to poor countries have access to vaccines. But Cuba doesn't classify. They say that we need to pay for the vaccines. Imagine, and only have like a 40% of our population vaccinated. That was crazy. And Cuba at that point decides to create our own vaccines, and use that money to create our own vaccines. And we not only create one vaccine, but two. And we, at the end of 2021, we have the entire population vaccinated, even the children until 2 years old. That was really a really big thing around the world, because children haven't been vaccinated at that time. So it was really difficult because Cuba was dealing with the pandemic, was dealing with the scarcity, was dealing with inflation. I was talking like really basic food, really basic medicines, ibuprofen, acetaminophen, whatever you need for a fever of a child. That was tough. And when the pandemic went like gone, everybody say, okay, now this is the time we need to. Well, Biden is already on the administration. A lot of people was hopeful about this guy really things kind of change for us, and nothing happened. Nothing happened because I have this feeling that the worst situation in Cuba, the hopeful are they are that the Cuban government is finally falling down and they are gonna win. And this is not happen. And this is not something that is going to happen. Uh, so they are playing the cards, they are playing with trying to earn votes, and they are also playing with the Cuban people suffering. And that's something that I, not because someone told me, this is something that I just realized when I talk with people in the United States, policymaking politicians, because they know that the sanctions hurt the people. They know that the sanctions, that the way it is, don't hurt the government, but the people. And they just doing nothing. They just waiting to the perfect political time. Where is the perfect political time? The United States. You are always in elections. The elections is always coming. The presidential elections, the midterm elections. Every time there is an elections coming. So where is the perfect moment? for this administration, by the administration, do something in order to release the sanctions in Cuba. For example, take Cuba out of the list is not something that depends of Congress. That's just something that Biden can do. And so far, nothing has happened.
Um, Now that you mention, well, actually, I think that showing in a lot of detail the very concrete consequences that all of these sanctions, including the blockade, the putting Cuba on the list of the sponsors of terrorists, all of the travel restrictions, and the numerous sanctions, is something that you show really well on your series, and I really want to encourage everybody to check it out because you see it in the intimacy and the day to day and all of the aspects of any average Cuban's lives. And I wanted to ask you, I think that work is so important, but I wanted to ask you, as a journalist and involved in this work of representing this and being familiar with the media landscape, how do you think that this reality gets represented both inside of Cuba and outside of Cuba, outside of the island? Like, how much do we have within the media for
Nothing. You have nothing represent our reality in the media because this is part of the misinformation that you watch here about Cuba. Everybody say Cuba is in a crisis. They love to say, but they don't explain why. The most of the time, the consequence is the mismanagement of the Cuban government, is whatever Cuban government, but they barely mentioned the sanctions. And you can compare a system of sanctions, like structures by United States. I'm not talking like a small island, another small island in the Caribbean. I'm talking this empire that the United States represents and is. This is system of sanctions of law the United States has been structured really well to apply into Cuba for more than 60 years can do any harm. And you can compare the impact of that in a country and also in the relation of that country around the world, because they always say, okay, the US sanctions to Cuba only affect the government. That's a lie. That's the big lie that I have been hearing my entire life. But it wasn't true. If it wasn't true, the most of the people in Cuba work for the government. And the most of the people in Cuba who work for the government are Black people. So now everybody here is like really afraid, and everybody was worried, at least in the media and the news that I have been seeing so far. They should out the government. They should out the government because it's affecting the public system in Cuba and the workers of public system. Imagine during 60 years, another country trying to shut down your government every day because, okay, they're trying to get the poor private enterprise, entrepreneurs in Cuba, but who cares about healthcare system? Who cares about public education system that is still running? And they have money to improve their exchange and everything to buy the books that they give for free to the students. Who cares about trash collection? If the government don't work, if the government doesn't work, the society can work well. So it's easy to attack the Cuban government to say, okay, this is all mismanagement, because you can see the private enterprise, but it's not mismanages. It's a war. It's economic war, and this is not me exaggerating. If you look for the meaning of economic war, is just like that. All the laws and the sanctions that the United States have been implementing against Cuba. They talk about, well, a lot of Cuban fluent from the communism. Before the 2019, the data from migration between Cuba and DR was the same, almost the same. And nobody was talking about Republican Dominicans flowing away from what? Communism too? No, it's a different completely system and also different completely country, but the migration to the north is the same. Because United States has been sold this that the thing that the American dream, and it's possible if you work hard. Once here, you realize that that's a liar, and this is American dream became American nightmare. But everybody's trying to get the better life that they can't, and trying to migrate in order to get that, because the most of the countries in Latin America has been destabilized for who? United States. So it's a contradiction that is, I think, I haven't seen watching the news so far, and I think that there's a lot of misinformation. There is a lot of people that they don't analyze the context is this migration appear, and also this is political prisoners, is the political refugees, and the ones that they got the green card, they come back to Cuba on vacation, see their families. There is not. But political refugees sell more newspaper than economical refugees.
Right. Right. So I think, I mean, the follow up that I was going to ask you to that is pretty evident, but how do you see the role of Belly of the Beast specifically, given the landscape, and what are the challenges? What have been the challenges in terms of representing this reality?
War is tough. It's not an easy way because we are a small media outlet, so and we work through donations. It's it's really difficult face all the censorship that exists online because Cuba is a really polarized country. Um, Talking to that openly, we have been facing a lot of, for example, visualizations, because we give our content for free to the people, but sometimes we need to over like go through the data and the ways that YouTube or Instagram socialize our content. For example, we have been plugged in Facebook since the beginning, even when we try to pay advertising to try to spread the voice about what we've been doing so far, and nobody's playing us. Why? It's like, okay, you are not like you are doing some. They say like we are how is the word when you are violating the law of Facebook, but they don't know, they don't explain what law or what specific thing we did wrong in different. So it's difficult because you can see a video about hungry in Cuba. People in Cuba are desperate. They have like millions of views immediately, and we are, and this is only opinion, no fact, no evidence, just someone with a cell phone speaking and trying to get uh, the people watch that, and it's really it's enough. Isn't journalism? It's just one human being, one person trying to talk about something. And we are really rigorous about the journalist that we did, about the fact. Maybe you are not agreed with our point of view, but you can see that we are lying or we are like hiding something, but because we're trying to present facts. Um, it's difficult, like a getaway and trying to put our content out and everybody can access to that, because first we think that it's necessary for the people in the US have like a different point of view, a different perspective from inside Cuba. That's totally different, because most of the time you say the parachute journalism, someone from the US or Europe come to Cuba to try to explain or to talk about democracy or social justice or how is this life compared with their own experience. But in this case, it's the other way around. First, I'm in Cuba. I'm living in Cuba, so I'm trying to tell to the people my own story. And second one, I have the opportunity to doing the parachute journalism, but from uh, Cuba to the United States. That this is something that you can really see in the medias here. So I bring like a different perspective. I have questions, a lot of questions, because the more of the politics here are affecting my country, and I don't have, and we don't have in Cuba any way to change that because this is something external to us. We can face the problems that we have in Cuba, but not the problems that come outside of Cuba that affect in Cuba. So there is a lot of things there, but we are trying our best. We are like a really small team, but I think that everybody has like a really compromise with the project of Belly of the Beast, and also with the work that we are trying to do, and the content what we are trying to get like a really good content, not only visual but also uh, investigative journalists to take to give to the people.
So let's talk about a very recent episode that was highly visible and I think very dramatic. And many of us saw reports, all kinds of reports about Cuba coming out of Cuba in the way that you just described, surrounding the July 11 protests in 2021. So I wanted to ask you, I think and it was also, you were referring to, it was in the middle of the pandemic, in a moment of deepened sanctions, and a closure of tourism, that massive protests emerged on the island. So I wanted to ask, how do you make sense of those popular uprisings? What was it that people were demanding, and what triggered the protests?
Well, desperation. People are tired, and they have all the right to be tired. They just want to wait more. They have a better future, and they want it now, no in a few years, because we have been waiting for that so long. So people are desperate, and I think the pandemic was a really critical moment. So, until that point, Cuba has under control. The data was in our favor in order to people who have been died for the COVID. But even in that moment, we are trying to get the vaccines ready in order to start the vaccination process earlier, and we couldn't do that because we are asking for specific raw materials for Cuban vaccines, and they make us wait for weeks for them for those raw materials, even when they know that we needed for Cuban vaccines against COVID in that moment. So it's a really sketchy process, and I think that desperation overcomes people. People in Cuba are desperate. They are not hopeful about the future. They just want to leave the country for a better one. Nobody knows who is the better one country for a migrant who come from Cuba or other Latin American country, but they just want to change the future. And and it was so in some point I get so cynical about, okay, people are asking for freedom. I was there, so I'm asking the people that what Joseph Field are asking, okay, libertad, freedom. What means libertad for you, freedom for you? What are you asking for? And they say, I don't know, I just buying food, like a lot of food, because I have that freedom, that idea of freedom relating with um, consumption, the idea of consumption that you have in the United States. That everybody's, it's like you have like a 20 kind of X. That's the kind of freedom that they want, but they don't understand. So I couldn't see that the majority of people have like political demands. Who are there? The most of the people are asking for food, medicine, because the whole protest was because of that, because the blackouts. Because people are tired of blackouts. Me too, I'm tired of the blackouts. I don't want a blackout. Nobody have to should live in a situation when they have to facing blackouts and a scarcity of food and medicine each day. That's an impossible situation for everybody. So it for me was a kind of for, and it was so surprising because in Cuba we don't see protests in that kind like frequently. So it was so surprising, but in some point I just sit and think about it. It's because people can't handle anymore. Because the situation is so bad and they can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Because there is not any light at the end of the tunnel. Because that doesn't depend of the Cuban administration do something in order to repair or fix it. Because if we have a plan A and that plan doesn't work, and the Cuban government has a plan B, so the Sanchez are going to attack the plan B. So in 60 years, I can imagine that the government went from plan A to plan Z, and nothing has happened, because the change that reality doesn't depend only of us. And that's the sad side of the story.
Maybe this is a little bit of a more hopeful shift, but and also a move away from the focus only on U.S. foreign policy on Cuba towards Cuba, but also thinking about the role of Cuba more broadly a major actor in South politics. And I was thinking
Yeah.
about the recent G77 meeting that Havana hosted, and I wanted to ask you how you see Cuba's role with the G77, if you can describe it, and what prospects do you see, maybe hopeful, maybe not, for economic development and climate change, which are two major challenges that we have ahead of us globally.
Yeah, well, the G77 went really well. We were reporting there, and it's amazing because this is you have like the South, the global South, pronouncing that how have been doing so far, and also how Cuba is an example the things that you can build from the global South to the world in science and technology and cooperation South to South. Um, and that was really good, an example that the things that we really actually can do. And if we have been doing that with the sanctions, imagine that we can accomplish without the sanctions. In some moments, I feel so hopeful about these people, but at the same time, I think, but also they are the victims from the US policy around the world. So they want to do business with Cuba. And I was in this screening. There is a woman from Haiti, and she say, "You're talking about how the sanctions affect Cuba, but I think that we need to think broadly and to talk about how the sanctions affect the relation that Cuba has with the rest of the Caribbean islands. Because, for example, in Haiti, we are thrilled to do a lot of stuff with Cuba, but our government is afraid because they are receiving a lot of funding from military aid from the United States. So nobody wants to face the bully. So we try to do, and there is a lot of progressive presidents and administrations in the South they are trying to build solidarity, cooperation, uh, with Cuba. But recently, there is a news that Mexico is trying to send in um, oil to Cuba, and United States stopped to give them money for a project that they have relating with someone. It's like is there can be a win-win. The cooperation south to south is win-win, but with the United States in the middle, it's like someone have to lose something. So maybe we are trying to get like a real good example and of how South-South cooperation looks like, but it's probably that you suffer from someone that the United States is trying to do you because United States runs the world. If we even we or not, and also I think it's also for me because it's the G77 is trying this South countries trying to build something, trying to overcome the obstacles, but they also talk the role that the North has in this process and these problems because they are in the place that they are because the North. So in some way, this is like I'm an active anti-racist activist, so it's the same. We are talking about how we can build and empower people, but at the same time, it's like what is the role of the allies that we need to bring, like the white people that are involved in anti-racist movement? What is the role of them? It's the same. We can talk about South-South cooperation, but we also have to talk about the role of the North in that cooperation and trying to overcome that situation. because it doesn't depend only the country who have been suffering from that.
And as individuals and as citizens, not only of the global south, I think this is the last question that I wanted to ask, but for those of us outside of Cuba, whether we are located in the US and Latin America and other parts of the global south, if we're interested in engaging in international solidarity, how can we support positive change for the people of Cuba?
I think that the first thing that you can do is come to Cuba, experience Cuba in your own way. And second, trying to connect with organizations that have been doing solidarity with Cuba. I think that they have like a lot of call actions for people, specific actions that you can do. Also, as a journalist, please spread the voice, spread our contents. Uh, if someone says something about Cuba that you consider misleading, just okay, maybe you don't have like a full understanding of Cuba. Maybe I can share with you some links about other contexts, about another point of view that can enrich the conversation. Um, and also, if you can connect, there is a lot of organizations in Cuba that have trying to keep the country running and working with civil society in Cuba that have been doing a lot with just if very little resources. That would be good. So if you have the opportunity to, because there is something that I realized that in Congress, in uphill on the hill, that there is a lot of people doing lobby for their different causes. I realized that there is a lot of people from Ukraine asking for money for more war. So maybe if you have a minute, you can call or send email to your representative at the Congress and say, okay, I'm interested about Cuba. What is your position about Cuba? Or I not agree with your position in this meeting or whatever about Cuba, and let them know that you have a different perspective and you're against the sanctions and against the policy that the United States is maintaining against Cuba. That would be good too, because this is something that we can't do.
Well, I think that's it. I want to thank you again for your time.
It was
And
a
I know that
pleasure.
it'll be an ongoing conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your time. And we will continue to spread the word of your work. Thank
Oh,
you.
thank you.